Hey, welcome back. So we were in the middle of classifying this cat right here according to Linnaeus' system of taxonomy. And there's actually a couple of additional levels that he didn't have that have since been added. And we'll talk about taxonomy always changing. But we were basically right here. We said there were 5 kingdoms. Right? So you have plants, they would all go in one kingdom. All bacteria would go in one kingdom, all protists would go in another, and all funguses would go in another. This box represents the animal kingdom. Within the kingdom Animalia, there are several phyla. All but one are invertebrates, or phyla that don't have backbones, and this one vertebrate phyla happens to be Chordata, which refers to, you at least start out with the structure called a notochord. Anyways, within the phylum Chordata, if you have a backbone like this cat, there are several classes, right, of chordates or vertebrates. And, you would have amphibians, reptiles, 3 different classes of fish. But, the mammal class, we'll look at this box. The class Mammalia, you would be in this box if you had fur, like this guy. If you suckled or nourished your young with milk, that would make you a mammal. Within the Mammalia class, there are several different orders, and the carnivores all tend to be, or the meat eaters all tend to be in this order called Carnivora. So this cat just eats meat. In the order Carnivora, there are several families, and this cat and all felines happen to be in the family Felidae. Dogs would be in a different family. And so, you go further down within this family, there are several genera or genuses. He happens to be in the genus Panthera because of his characteristics. And then within that genus Panthera, there are more than one species probably, and this happens to be the species Panthera pardus. Moving on. So here's some questions. You might want to pause right now, see if you can answer them on your own. I'll give you the answers in 3 seconds. So similar genera or genuses would be grouped together in one level above, which would be the family level. And similar families, if they were kind of related, they would all be grouped together in the same level above or order. Which taxon is the most inclusive? That would be the kingdom taxon. And the least inclusive one, of course, would be species. That would include the least number of organisms. So each level is called a taxon. All right, so binomial nomenclature, it's 2 naming system. The 7 levels of taxonomic categories, they are kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. You have to figure out a way to write this down in order on the next quiz. You might want to come up with a mnemonic device. Back when I was in your seats, we used one I still remember, but it's probably politically incorrect today. We said kings play chess on fat girls' stomachs. I like it. It really paints a picture, but you might want to make up your own. And remember, you're going to have to spell out all of these different categories. So you have to know that it's not just P. It would have to be phylum. All right. Moving on. So taxonomy is always changing. That would be another blank in your notes. It's always changing. As we find out more about living things, we always change our system of taxonomy. And we've done that ever since Aristotle really was the first person to ever think about grouping organisms. And you would probably group them the way he did too. He said that there were basically animals in one group and plants in another. And, if it was moving, it was probably an animal. And if it looked like it was a living thing but didn't move, you would probably put it in the plant category. But now we found out all of this information about like DNA relationships and evolutionary descent. So we've totally changed Linnaeus' system, which was primarily just based on physical characteristics. So biologists now group organisms into categories that represent lines of evolutionary descent. And here's some pretty important ones. The fossil record. So we can infer how closely related organisms are according to where they show up in the fossil record. We'll talk more about this when we look at the theory of evolution. So index fossils would be fossils that exist at no other time in the fossil record. So they're only found in 1 or 2 layers and they're never found again or before. DNA, this is probably the biggest one. So we now can sequence any organism's DNA. And so if 2 organisms have a very similar genetic makeup, we would put them in a very similar taxon, right? They might be in the same genus, right? But if their DNA and protein similarities are different, then they would be in, they wouldn't be in the smaller taxonomic categories together. Homologous body structures, this would be like looking at arm bones among mammals. So all mammals have, phalanges, those would be your digits on your fingers, and carpals, your hand bones, and metacarpals, your wrist bones, and a radius, and an ulna in your forearm, and a humerus. Well, bats have that. Even whales and their flippers have that. So using homologous body structures is another way to categorize organisms. So here's a question. Is a domestic dog more closely related to an otter or a cat looking at this picture? This picture is called a phylogenetic tree. It's an important picture, and the way you read them all the time is down here where you see time, that's way in the distant past. And then at the very top of the diagram, that is the organisms that are alive on the planet today. And so what do you think on this question? So domestic dog is over here, Canis familiaris. Is it more closely related to an otter or a cat? And then why? Well, we would say it's more closely related to an otter, and pay attention to the verbiage. The reason is the dog and the otter share a more recent common ancestor right here. Now the domestic dog and the domestic cat, they have a common ancestor as well, down here, but it's further back in time. So we would say they have a more distant common ancestor. So the best way to answer a question like this is the dog and the otter share a more recent common ancestor on the phylogenetic tree. Okay, so now flipping the page to your, you've got a concept map there, the most current system, and I'm looking at the one with a bunch of rectangles on it, and it says there's 3 domains, and then there's 6 kingdoms. So we said in Linnaeus's system that the kingdom was the biggest category. Well, it turns out now, since about the mid-70s, we've added a higher level, an 8th level, and we would call the super level the domain. I think the system's kind of dumb because 2 of the 3 domains only have 1 kingdom in them, and then the 3rd one has 4. But there's your 3 domains. Please make sure you study this graphic in your notes and pay close attention to the note at the bottom that says, the 5 kingdom system, the original one before the 70s, has only 5 kingdoms and no domains. In the 5 kingdom system, all bacteria were in the kingdom Monera. So all the bacteria would be in the kingdom Monera. The 6 kingdom system uses a higher taxon called the domain. In the 6 kingdom system, the bacteria kingdom Monera was split into 2 new kingdoms. So on the PowerPoint up here, here's your 5 kingdom system, where all the bacteria would be in this kingdom Monera. Now we divide this bacteria kingdom into 2, and those 2 bacteria kingdoms, if you look at your concept map, one is Archaebacteria, they would be the most primitive, and the second bacteria kingdom would be the Eubacteria, which means true bacteria. All right, so looking, and please, refer back to that concept map, but moving on in the fill-in-the-blank notes, you've got the first kingdom, Eubacteria. I'm sorry, Archaebacteria. Archaebacteria they're prokaryotic, which hopefully you remember means that they They don't have a nucleus. They're bacteria. All bacteria are prokaryotic, and only bacteria are prokaryotic. These are the most primitive bacteria, we would say, and they're always unicellular. All bacteria are unicellular. And here's the big difference. How do I tell the difference between the two bacteria kingdoms? Well, in the cell walls of archaebacteria, the primitive ones, they don't have this fancy chemical that you have to memorize the name of called peptidoglycan. It's a compound that would be sophisticated enough evolutionarily to totally put these guys in a whole different domain, a whole different super level than their other bacteria cousins. Remember, there's two kingdoms of bacteria. This kingdom, the most ancient one, they don't have peptidoglycan in their cell walls. And they're thought to be the first living things. These are the oldest fossils. There's some, interpretation. It's subject to interpretation. Those tiny, tiny little fossils, we would guess to be the archaebacteria. So archaebacteria are found in extreme environments. You've got your methanogens that live in an anaerobic environment. That's a pretty important vocabulary term we'll need next semester. Anaerobic means an environment without oxygen, like the deep mud at the bottom of ponds, like in the school pond. When it turns over, sometimes you'll smell like sulfur. That would be the result of methanogenic bacteria, which happen to be chemosynthetic. Remember, most autotrophs are photosynthetic. They do photosynthesis, but those bacteria that live in the tissues of the giant red tube worms down at the hydrothermal vents at the mid-Atlantic ridge are chemosynthetic. Methanogens are also chemosynthetic. The next group of archaebacteria that we need to know about are the extreme halophiles. Halo refers to salt, and so they live in very salty water, like the Dead Sea. The next kind is the thermoacidophiles. They live in hot, almost boiling water, and this is a picture of a hot spring at Yellowstone, and you can actually use the colors as a thermometer. Different species of extreme thermophiles, they live at different places at different temperatures. So the hottest part is down here. The least hot part, which is still very hot, is on the edges. And this species of thermoacidophile lives here, and this one, a different one lives down here. It's kind of interesting. So these archaebacteria would be considered much less complex than other kingdoms of life, but they're still incredibly complicated because they're a living thing, and all living things are inherently complex. Okay, the kingdom Eubacteria is next. Remember, looking at your notes, notice that there's only one kingdom in the domain bacteria, and that kingdom is Eubacteria. In the domain Archaea, if you look up above the notes we just took, in the domain Archaea, there's just one kingdom, Archaebacteria. So in the domain bacteria, kingdom Eubacteria, these are what you think of as true bacteria. And like any bacteria, they're prokaryotic. They don't have a nucleus. They always are unicellular. And here's how you tell the difference. Their cell walls do have this sophisticated chemical in the matrix of their cell walls called peptidoglycan. And we would say they're more complex than archaebacteria, but because they're bacteria, they're much less complex than any of the other eukaryotic kingdoms. So notice prokaryotes don't have a nucleus, but they do have DNA, this what they're calling a nucleoid. It's not a nucleus. It's just DNA that hasn't been organized in a separate membrane-bound nucleus. They have cell membranes, they have cell walls, and they also sometimes have a capsule on the outside. All right, moving on. Bacteria, there's always three. These are kind of rudimentary classifications based on shape. So we would call the tic-tac shape a bacillus bacteria, B-A-C-I-L-L-U-S. Ones that look like tiny dots, those are coccus. When we do our microscope lab, you might see all three kinds. And then there's also spirillum bacteria that look like little spirals.